The barrel of my shotgun was cold against my cheek, but the sweat trickling down my spine felt like boiling oil. And for the first time in 3 months, I wasn't shaking from the radiation sickness. I was shaking because the thing standing in the doorway wasn't breathing. It stood there, a silhouette cut from the deepest fabric of the night, motionless against the backdrop of a hallway that smelled of wet drywall and ancient, copper-tasting blood. I held my breath, the rubber seal of my gas mask biting into the bridge of my nose, praying that the condensation fogging up my left lens wouldn't obscure my aim. You see, in the dead zone, silence isn't empty, it is a heavy, physical weight that presses against your eardrums until you swear you can hear the blood rushing through your own veins, sounding like a roaring river in a canyon. I had spent exactly 100 days in this exclusion zone. A sprawling concrete graveyard encompassed by a 30-foot steel wall that hummed with enough voltage to cook an elephant, and in all that time, the only conversations I'd had were with the scratching of rats inside the walls and the rhythmic clicking of my Geiger counter. Day 100 was supposed to be just another tally mark scratched into the peeling paint of my safe house wall. Another breakfast of stale crackers and filtered rainwater that tasted like iodine. I remember waking up that morning, the gray light filtering through the boarded-up windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air like microscopic ghosts. I went through the routine that kept me sane: check the filters, check the ammo, check the perimeter. The city outside was a monolith of decay, skyscrapers stripped of their glass like picked bones, vines choking the life out of rusted sedans, and a sky that seemed perpetually bruised with shades of purple and charcoal. I walked for hours that day, my boots crunching over layers of shattered glass and dried leaves, navigating the labyrinth of the financial district where the turned usually congregated in the shadows of the subway entrances. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a replacement battery for my long-range receiver, a futile hope I clung to like a talisman. I found myself in the ruins of an old broadcasting station on 5th and Main, the air inside thick with the scent of ozone and mold. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating overturned desks and skeletons still wearing corporate lanyards, their hollow eyes staring eternally at ceiling tiles that had long since rotted away. I reached the main control booth, a glass-walled sanctuary that overlooked the dead city, and there it was, a pristine, military-grade receiver sitting atop a console covered in dust. My hands trembled as I swapped the battery, the plastic casing clicking into place with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I put the headphones on, expecting the usual white noise, the hiss of a dead world. But then it happened. Through the static, cutting through the interference of the radiation storms, a sound pierced my soul. It wasn't the guttural growl of a walker. It wasn't the wind. It was a cough. A distinct, sharp, human cough, followed by a voice that sounded like it hadn't spoken in years, cracking and dry, whispering 3 impossible words. Is anyone left? For a moment, the world simply stopped spinning. The words, "Is anyone left?" hung in the air, suspended in the amber of the dead silence that surrounded me. They didn't fade, they seemed to etch themselves into the grime on the inside of my visor. My heart, which had been a steady, grim metronome for the last 3 months, suddenly slammed against my ribs with the violence of a caged bird realizing the door was open. I stopped breathing. I literally forgot how to exhale, my lungs holding on to that pocket of recycled, rubber-tasting air as if letting it go would break the spell. I stared at the radio receiver. It was a bulky, olive-drab unit, the kind the National Guard used before the grid went down and the fires started. The frequency display glowed with a faint, amber luminescence, reading 462. 5625 MHz. FRS Channel 1. The Universal Distress Channel. The one everyone checked. The one no one ever answered. My hand, still hovering over the battery compartment, began to shake. Not a tremor, but a violent vibration that traveled up my forearm and settled in my shoulder. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the sudden, crushing weight of possibility. For 100 days, hope had been a dangerous luxury, a calorie-burning emotion that I couldn't afford. Survival was a binary state. You were alive, or you were turned. There was no third option. But that voice. It was male, gritty, sounding as if the throat that produced it had been lined with sandpaper and ash. It had the distinct cadence of exhaustion, the flat effect of someone who expected no reply. I slowly withdrew my hand from the battery casing and moved it toward the microphone. The plastic of the push-to-talk button was worn smooth, shiny from the thumbs of dead men who had sat in this very chair, begging for extraction that never came. Do I answer? The thought paralyzed me. In the dead zone, noise is death. We learned that in the first week. The Turned aren't just mindless shamblers, they are acoustic predators. Their eyes have clouded over with cataracts of fungal growth, rendering them blind, but their ears have evolved. They can hear a boot snap a twig from 3 blocks away. They can hear a whimper through a brick wall. And a radio transmission? If there were any receivers left on. If there were any of those monstrosities that had retained enough motor function to interact with technology, or worse. If there were other survivors who were less than friendly. Broadcasting my voice was akin to firing a flare into a pitch-black room full of tigers. I hesitated, my thumb hovering millimeters above the button. The static hissed, a rhythmic wash of white noise that sounded like the ocean dragging shingle over a beach. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. The silence stretched, elastic and terrifying. Please, the voice came again, softer this time, cracking on the vowel. I have a child. We are low on water. If anyone can hear this, we are at the. A burst of static, violent and sharp, tore through the transmission. It sounded like interference, the kind caused by the high-voltage storms that rolled off the irradiated coast. The signal garbled, twisting into a screech of electronic feedback before cutting out completely. Hello? I whispered, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. I didn't press the button. I just spoke into the dead air of the control booth. Hello? Nothing but the hiss. I sat back, the leather of the chair groaning beneath me. The sweat inside my suit was beginning to cool, turning clammy against my skin. My mind began to race, calculating, analyzing, trying to dismantle the miracle I had just witnessed. Was it a recording? A looped distress call left on repeat by a survivor who had long since perished? No. The cough. The pause. The desperation. It was live. It had to be live. And he said he had a child. I looked out the shattered window of the control booth. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon of the city, casting long, skeletal shadows across the streets below. The sky was bruising further, shifting from charcoal to a deep, sickly plum color that warned of a coming radiation spike. I had to move. The broadcasting station was a good vantage point, but it was a tactical nightmare. One way in, one way out, the stairwell. If a herd of the Turned drifted into the lobby, I would be trapped here, starving to death while listening to the static. I grabbed the receiver. It was heavy, maybe 10 pounds, but I didn't care. I disconnected it from the console, the cables snapping free with dry pops. I shoved it into my rucksack, nestled between my rolled-up sleeping bag and my last 2 cans of peaches. The weight was comforting, a tangible anchor to the new reality. I did a quick sweep of the room, practicing the discipline that had kept me alive this long. Flashlight off. Check the floor for debris. Check the corners. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the cold metal. Silence. I cracked it open, the hinges screaming in protest despite my slow movement. The hallway beyond was a throat of darkness, smelling of damp carpet and rot. My descent was slow. Agonizingly slow. Every step was a negotiation with the building's decay. I stuck to the edges of the stairs, where the structure was soundest, stepping over piles of office refuse, scattered papers, overturned trash cans. A single high-heeled shoe that looked heartbreakingly normal amidst the chaos. On the fourth floor I froze. A sound. It came from the elevator shaft to my left. A wet, rhythmic slapping sound. Like a wet towel being hit against concrete. Asterisk slap. Drag. Slap. Drag. Asterisk. I held my breath, the air in my mask growing stale. I crouched low, blending into the shadows of the landing. Through the gap in the elevator doors, which had been pried open by some long-forgotten struggle, I saw movement. Down in the darkness of the shaft, something was climbing the cables. It was a silhouette, lanky and distorted, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and insect-like. One of the climbers. A mutation I had only seen twice before. They had elongated fingers, fused bone and cartilage into hooks that allowed them to scale concrete and steel. It was heading up. Toward the roof. Toward where I had just been. I waited until the slapping sound faded into the upper floors before I moved again. My heart was hammering so hard I thought the vibrations would shake the dust off my suit. I descended the remaining floors with a reckless fluidity, trading silence for speed. When I hit the lobby, the smell hit me even through the filters, a cloying, sweet scent of decay mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. The lobby was a graveyard. The reception desk was overturned. The marble floor was slick with a black sludge that I knew better than to touch. I pushed through the revolving door, the glass spiderwebbed with cracks, and spilled out onto Fifth Avenue. The air outside was heavy, charged with the static of the coming storm. The wind whipped debris down the canyon of skyscrapers, sending old newspapers tumbling like tumbleweeds. I checked my wrist-mounted Geiger counter. The needle was dancing in the yellow zone. 2.5 microsieverts per hour. High, but manageable for short exposure. The trek back to my safe house was usually a 40-minute jog. Today, it felt like a pilgrimage through hell. The voice in my head kept replaying the transmission. Asterisk, we are low on water. Asterisk. I navigated the labyrinth of stalled cars, using them as cover. The vehicles were rusted hulks, their paint stripped by acid rain, tires melted into black puddles on the asphalt. I kept my MP5 submachine gun raised, the stock pressed tight into my shoulder. I only had 3 magazines left. 90 rounds. Not enough for a war, but enough for a skirmish. As I crossed the intersection of Main and Broadway, I saw them. A cluster of turned, standing motionless in the center of the street. There were 6 of them, facing away from me, staring at the setting sun. This was a behavior I had documented on day 45. They seemed drawn to the UV radiation, as if the fungus that piloted their nervous systems was photosynthesizing. They stood like statues, their skin gray and calcified, clothes hanging off their gaunt frames in tatters. I needed to cross the street. Detouring would add 20 minutes and take me through the subway tunnels, a suicide mission. I had to slip past them. I lowered my profile, crouching until my knees scraped the asphalt. I moved heel to toe, rolling my weight to minimize the crunch of gravel. The wind was in my favor, blowing my scent away from them. I crept behind a rusted delivery truck, peering around the wheel well. One of the turned, a female wearing the remnants of a nurse's scrub, twitched. Her head snapped to the side, scanning. I froze, becoming part of the truck. She let out a low, gurgling chuff, the sound of fluid trapped in a collapsing lung, and then returned to her vigil. I exhaled slowly. I moved again. 10 yards. 20. I reached the other side of the street and slipped into the alleyway that served as the back door to my sector. My safe house was located in the basement of an old bank vault. It was impenetrable, shielded by 3 feet of steel and concrete. It was the only place in the dead zone where I could sleep without one eye open. I reached the hidden entrance, a storm drain I had modified with a hydraulic lift I'd scavenged from an auto shop. I punched in the mechanical combination, feeling the tumblers click through the vibration in the steel. The hatch hissed open, revealing the dark, welcoming mouth of my sanctuary. I dropped inside and sealed the hatch above me. The sound of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by the low hum of my generator and the recycling of the air filtration system. But I wasn't safe yet. The ritual had to be completed. I stepped into the airlock, a makeshift decontamination chamber I had built from plastic sheeting and duct tape. I stripped off my outer gear, the tactical vest, the rucksack, the knee pads. I grabbed the spray bottle of bleach solution and doused myself, scrubbing the rubber of my hazmat suit until it glistened. I checked the Geiger counter again. Green zone. Clean. Only then did I reach up and break the seal of my mask. The hiss of the pressure equalizing was the best sound in the world. I pulled the mask off, the rubber peeling away from my sweat-soaked face. The air in the vault smelled of ozone, old paper, and canned beans, but to me, it smelled like life. I took a deep breath, running my hand through my hair, which was matted and greasy. I caught my reflection in the polished steel of the vault door. Eyes sunken, dark circles like bruises, a beard that was getting too long to maintain a proper seal on the mask. I looked like a ghost haunting a machine. But there was no time for self-pity. I grabbed the rucksack and pulled out the receiver. I set it up on the central table, clearing away a map of the city I had been meticulously updating. I connected it to the external antenna array I had rigged through the ventilation shaft, a dangerous gamble that risked bringing in contaminated air, but necessary for signal range. I hooked up the battery. I plugged in my headset. I sat down. My hand trembled again as I reached for the dial. I tuned it back to 462. 5,625 megahertz. Static. Just the endless, hateful static. I grabbed my notebook, a tattered moleskine filled with the ravings of my isolation. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, *day 100. Contact. Male voice. Child present. Low water. Signal source unknown, but clear enough to be within the city limits. Interference suggests a ground-level transmission, possibly shielded. Asterisk. I stared at the radio. I needed to eat. My stomach was cramping, a hollow ache that gnawed at my spine. I opened a can of cold beans, eating them mechanically with a spoon, not tasting anything. My eyes never left the amber frequency display. "Come on," I whispered, a piece of bean skin stuck in my teeth. "Say it again." The isolation of the past 100 days began to wage war with this new development. Part of my brain, the lizard brain that kept me alive, screamed that it was a trap. That the Tern were evolving, mimicking prey to lure me out. Or that bandits, the raiders rumored to prowl the edges of the zone, were setting up an ambush. But the other part of me, the part that remembered what Sunday mornings used to feel like, the part that remembered the warmth of a human hand. That part was weeping. I spent the next 4 hours turning the dial by fractions of a millimeter. I adjusted the squelch. I played with the gain. I scanned the adjacent channels, hoping they had just drifted off frequency. Nothing. Night had fully fallen outside. I could feel the temperature drop in the vault, the concrete walls radiating the cold of the earth. The generator chugged rhythmically, counting down the seconds of my life. I was about to give up, to accept that I had hallucinated the whole thing out of sheer loneliness, when the static changed texture. It wasn't a voice. It was a pattern. Asterisk click. Click click. Click. Asterisk. I pressed the headphones so hard against my ears it hurt. Asterisk click. Click click. Click. Asterisk. Morse code? No, too irregular. It sounded like tapping. Like someone tapping a microphone against a hard surface. Or tapping a ring against a pipe. Then, the voice returned. But it was different this time. Weaker. Distant. Tried the North Bridge. Blocked by huge herd, moving back to the signal drifted into a wave of distortion that sounded like tearing metal. I lunged for the transmit button, my discipline shattering. "This is Watchtower 1, I said, my voice cracking. I hadn't used my call sign in 3 months. "This is Watchtower 1. I hear you. You are breaking up. Repeat your location. Over." I released the button. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a skull. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Then, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't the man. It wasn't the child. It was a screech. A high-pitched, digital screech that tore through the headphones, spiking the VU meter into the red. It wasn't interference. It was a handshake protocol. A digital signal trying to lock onto my transmission. I ripped the headphones off, throwing them onto the table. Someone, or something, was tracing the signal. I scrambled to the back of the receiver and yanked the antenna cable out. The screeching stopped instantly, replaced by the room's silence. I stood there, panting, staring at the disconnected cable. They weren't just broadcasting. They were listening. And for the briefest second, I had just lit a signal fire in the middle of a dark forest. I looked at the map on the table. The man had said North Bridge. The North Bridge connected the financial district to the industrial sector. The industrial sector was a death trap, a maze of chemical plants and collapsed warehouses. But if they were there, and if they were heading back. I traced a line from the bridge with my finger. Moving back to the what? The cathedral? The stadium? The hospital? My finger stopped on a building located 6 blocks south of the bridge. The Museum of Natural History. Thick walls. Limited entry points. A defensible structure. I looked at the Geiger counter, then at my weapons locker. I had 100 days of survival under my belt. I had food, I had water, I had safety. I could stay here and rot in comfort. But the echo of that cough haunted me. A child. I walked over to the wall where I marked the days. I picked up a piece of charcoal and drew a line through the 4 vertical hashes I had made this morning. A completed set. 100 days. I turned back to the map. "I'm coming," I whispered to the empty room. I needed to prepare. Tomorrow, I wasn't just surviving. I was hunting. And for the first time in 100 days, I had a destination. The silence in the bunker was no longer a comfort. For 100 days, the quiet had been my shield, a thick blanket protecting me from the chaos that had consumed the world outside. Now, after hearing that voice, after hearing that digital scream, the silence felt like a breathless anticipation. The room felt smaller. The air, recycled and scrubbed for months, suddenly tasted stale, like the inside of a tomb that had been sealed just a moment too long. I stared at the disconnected antenna cable, the copper wire glinting under the harsh fluorescent light. I had cut the line. I had gone dark. But the seed had been planted. I wasn't alone. And worse, I wasn't hidden anymore. Preparation became my therapy. It was the only way to keep the panic from seizing my muscles. I moved to the weapons locker, the metal floor cold against my bare feet. I needed to think like a machine. Emotions were liabilities. Hope was a variable I couldn't afford to calculate, yet it was the only thing driving my hands. If I was going to the Museum of Natural History, I was crossing the heart of the dead zone. 6 blocks doesn't sound like much to someone from the old world. But in the zone, 6 blocks is an odyssey. It is a landscape of unstable geometry, radiation pockets, and things that hunt by the sound of a heartbeat. I opened the locker. My reflection in the polished steel was gaunt, the beard unkempt, eyes wide and rimmed with red. I didn't recognize the man, but I recognized the gear. I reached for the frame of my pack. Internal frame, reinforced nylon, modified with quick-release clips. I laid it on the table next to the map. First came the vitals. Water. The zone's water was poison, a cocktail of heavy metals and strange, blooming algae that defied biology. I packed 2 bladders, 3 liters each, and a filtration pump with a ceramic core. I added iodine tablets, wrapping the glass bottle in duct tape to prevent clinking. Noise discipline was the first rule of survival. If you can be heard, you can be killed. Next, calories. MREs were heavy, but I needed the salt and the density. I stripped them from their bulky outer packaging, saving ounces, and shoved the vacuum-sealed pouches into the gaps of the pack. Peanut butter crackers, jalapeno cheese spread. The menu of the apocalypse. I calculated for 3 days. If I didn't find them or a safe harbor by then, food would be the least of my problems. Then came the hardware. I picked up the Geiger counter. The yellow case was battered, the screen scratched, but the needle still danced when I brought it near the sample of trinitite I kept in a lead box. I checked the batteries, then taped 2 spares to the back of the unit. I clipped it to the left shoulder strap of the pack. I needed to hear it click without looking down. I turned to the firearms. The AR-15 was reliable, familiar. I stripped it down right there on the table, oiling the bolt carrier group, checking the gas rings. The smell of CLP solvent was the most comforting scent in the world. It smelled like control. I reassembled it, the metallic snap of the pins sliding home echoing in the room. I loaded 4 magazines with 55-grain ball ammunition. I didn't want hollow points. In the zone, you needed penetration. You never knew if you were shooting at flesh, Kevlar, or the hardened carapace of something that had mutated in the fallout. I placed the rifle in the scabbard attached to the side of the pack. For close quarters, I took the SIG P226. It went into the drop leg holster. A knife, 6 inches of carbon steel, went onto my belt. Finally, the suit. This was the barrier between life and the slow, agonizing death of the zone. It wasn't a full hazmat suit, those were too clumsy, too hot for combat or evasion. It was a scavenger's rig. Heavy canvas pants reinforced with rubberized patches at the knees and groin. A jacket lined with lead fiber mesh. And the mask. The M50 gas mask with dual filters. I checked the seals, running my finger along the rubber gasket. A single hairline crack meant death. I pulled the straps tight, testing the fit, inhaling sharply. The valves clicked. The seal held. I packed 2 spare filters, vacuum-sealed in plastic. I stood fully loaded. The weight of the pack was significant, roughly 60 pounds, but it felt grounding. It anchored me to the earth. I looked around the bunker one last time. The cot with the unmade blanket. The wall with the 100 hash marks. The radio, silent and dead. I was leaving the womb. I reached out and turned off the lights. The emergency red LEDs kicked in, bathing the room in the color of blood. I walked to the airlock door. Turning the wheel required both hands and a grunt of exertion. The mechanism groaned, the steel complaining after months of stasis. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping pressure, the sound of the bunker exhaling. I stepped into the decontamination chamber, pulled the inner door shut, and spun the wheel until it locked. I was in the purgatory between safety and hell. I hit the cycle button. The overhead jets blasted me with a fine mist of disinfectant, blinding me for a moment. When it stopped, the outer door light turned green. I pushed the heavy steel door outward. It swung open, revealing the world I had hidden from. It was gray. That was always the first thing that hit you. The color had been drained from the world. The sky wasn't blue or black, it was the color of a bruising storm. A perpetual twilight caused by the particulate matter hanging in the upper atmosphere. The street outside the bunker entrance, an alleyway in the old garment district, was choked with debris. Cars sat rusting, their tires dissolved into black puddles. Papers, trash, and bones formed drifts against the brick walls like snow. But it was the silence that had teeth. In the bunker, the silence was empty. Here, the silence felt heavy, watchful. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. I stepped out, my boots crunching on broken glass. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. I froze, crouching instinctively, rifle raised, scanning the rooftops. The windows of the skyscrapers above were like hollow eyes, black and jagged. Nothing moved. No birds. No wind. Just the oppressive stillness of the dead zone. I checked the Geiger counter. The needle hovered in the green, but it was ticking. Asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk a steady rhythm, the heartbeat of the city. Low background radiation. Safe enough for transit, dangerous for long-term exposure. I adjusted my mask, the rubber biting into my jaw, and started moving north. The plan was to hug the shadows. The center of the street was a kill zone. I moved along the building line, stepping over collapsed masonry and the rusted remains of a hot dog cart. My eyes scanned constantly: ground, horizon, rooftops. Ground, horizon, rooftops. The pattern was ingrained in my nervous system. Crossing the first intersection was the first test. The traffic lights hung limp on their wires, swaying slightly in a draft I couldn't feel. I waited for 10 minutes, just watching the cross street. A piece of newspaper tumbled across the asphalt, and I nearly squeezed the trigger. I forced my breathing to slow. Asterisk in through the nose, out through the mouth. Asterisk I sprinted across the gap, the 60 pounds of gear slamming against my back with every stride, and dove into the alcove of a shattered bank lobby. Inside the bank, the air was cooler. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light cutting through the gloom. The floor was a carpet of withdrawal slips and shattered safety deposit boxes. Looters had been here, probably in the first week. I navigated the maze of overturned desks. I needed to reach the subway tunnels. The streets were too exposed, and if that drone or whatever had made that screech was airborne, I was a sitting duck under the open sky. The entrance to the subway was a gaping maw in the sidewalk, dark and foreboding. I clicked on my weapon light, keeping the beam focused low. The stairs were slick with a black, oily substance. I descended, the temperature dropping with every step. The air down here smelled different, metallic, with a hint of ozone and rot. I reached the turnstiles. They were locked in place, rusted solid. I vaulted over them, landing silently on the balls of my feet. The platform was empty, save for a few sleeping bags that looked like they hadn't been occupied in years. I checked the tracks. No power. The third rail was dead. I dropped down onto the gravel and started walking north, toward the financial district. The tunnel was a sensory deprivation tank. The darkness was absolute beyond the cone of my flashlight. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots and the rhythmic hiss-click of my respirator. I counted my steps. 100. 200. My mind began to drift, pulling me back to the voice on the radio. Asterisk North Bridge, huge herd. Asterisk. What was a herd? In the old days, that meant cattle. Sheep. Now? It could mean the infected. Or it could mean the machines. Rumors of autonomous construction drones going rogue had circulated before the networks went down. Swarms of metal locusts stripping buildings for copper and steel. If a herd of those was blocking the bridge, the man and the child didn't stand a chance. And neither did I. I walked for an hour. The Geiger counter spiked twice, forcing me to double back and find a service tunnel to bypass a radioactive leakage from a fractured wall. The maintenance corridors were tight, claustrophobic nightmares of dripping pipes and scurrying rats. These rats were wrong, too big, hairless, with eyes that reflected the light with a pale, milky luminescence. I kicked one away as it lunged for my boot, its teeth snapping on the reinforced leather. It squealed, a sound too close to a human cry, and scurried into a drain. I emerged from the subway system 4 blocks south of the bridge. I came up through a ventilation grate in a parking garage. The effort of pushing the grate open left me panting, sweat soaking the underlayer of my suit. I sat on the concrete floor of the garage, checking my vitals. Hydration was good. Heart rate was elevating. The proximity to the target was making me jittery. I moved to the edge of the parking structure. I was on the 3rd floor, giving me a vantage point over the street below. I raised my rifle, looking through the optic. The financial district was a graveyard of giants. The steel skeletons of unfinished skyscrapers loomed over the older, stone structures. And there, in the distance, was the North Bridge. It was a mess. Cars were piled 10 high in a barricade that looked intentional. But it wasn't the cars that froze my blood. It was the movement. I dialed up the magnification on the scope. They were there. The herd. They weren't machines. They weren't infected humans. They were shadows. That was the only way to describe them. Vague, shifting shapes of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around them. They moved with a fluid, jerky motion, like a video buffering. They swarmed over the barricade, hundreds of them, picking through the wreckage. I lowered the rifle, my hands trembling. I had heard stories of the glitches, anomalies in the dead zone where reality seemed to fray. I thought they were campfire stories, hallucinations of radiation-addled brains. But there they were. And if the survivors had tried to cross that bridge, they had walked straight into a nightmare. I looked away from the bridge, tracing the line south. The Museum of Natural History. It was a massive Beaux-Arts structure, looking like a fortress from another age. It was dark, silent. But as I watched, I saw it. A flicker. It was so brief I almost missed it. A tiny spark of light in one of the upper windows. A reflection? No. It happened again. Asterisk short. 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 Long, 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 short. 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 Asterisk. SOS. Someone was there. They were alive. The signal was weak, using a flashlight or a mirror, desperate and fading. I checked the sky. The twilight was deepening into true night. Moving now was suicide. The glitches on the bridge seemed to become more active as the light failed, their forms elongating, stretching out across the street. I needed a hide. I couldn't breach the museum tonight. I had to wait for dawn, when the shadows retreated. I retreated into the depths of the parking garage, finding a janitor's closet with a heavy steel door. I swept it for bugs, biological and electronic, and laid out my bedroll. I wedged a piece of rebar under the door handle. It wouldn't stop a dedicated assault, but it would give me a second of warning. I sat in the dark, pulling the mask off for a brief moment to drink. The air in the closet was dusty but breathable. I took a sip of water, holding it in my mouth, savoring the wetness. I ate a cracker, the dry crunch sounding deafening in the small space. My mind raced. The digital screech. The handshake protocol. The glitches. It was all connected. Someone was controlling the zone, or at least monitoring it. And I had just walked into their arena. I put the headphones on, not connecting them to the antenna, just wearing them to muffle the sound of my own breathing. I closed my eyes, trying to force sleep. But then, through the walls, through the concrete and the steel, I felt it. A vibration. A rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Asterisk thump. 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 Asterisk. It felt like footsteps. Massive, heavy footsteps. Like a titan walking through the city streets. I placed my hand on the floor. The concrete trembled slightly with each impact. I scrambled to put my mask back on, grabbing my rifle. I crawled to the door, removing the rebar, and cracked it open just an inch. From my vantage point, looking out through the open side of the garage, I could see the street leading to the museum. Something was walking down the avenue. It towered over the streetlights. A tripod structure, 3 long, spindly legs supporting a central bulbous chassis. It moved with a terrifying grace, stepping over the wreckage of cars without disturbing them. It was silent, utterly silent, despite its size. The thumping I felt was the displacement of air, the pressure wave of its movement, not the physical impact. It wasn't a glitch. It was a machine. A harvester. A searchlight mounted on its underbelly swept the buildings. The beam was a piercing violet light. It swept over the facade of the museum. It lingered on the window where I had seen the SOS. My heart hammered against my ribs. It knew. It was hunting them. The machine stopped. Its legs locked into place. A low hum began to emanate from it, rising in pitch until it matched the digital screech I had heard on the radio. The violet light intensified, pulsing. It was jamming them. It was keeping them pinned. I realized then that the North Bridge message hadn't been a status update. It had been a lure. Or a trap. The survivors were pinned in the museum, and this thing was the warden. I looked at my rifle. 56mm ammo against a walker the size of a building? Useless. I needed a new plan. I needed to get inside that museum without alerting the warden. I pulled out the map again, illuminating it with the red lens of my flashlight. The subway. The tunnels I had just left. If I retraced my steps, went back 2 stations, there was a spur line. An abandoned service track that ran under the park. It went right under the foundations of the museum. It would be a swim through toxic sludge in the dark. I looked back at the machine. It stood like a sentinel, its violet eye unblinking. "Hold on," I whispered, gripping the rifle until my knuckles turned white. Just hold on. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the variable they hadn't calculated. I packed up my gear. There would be no sleep tonight. I was going back into the dark. I was going to swim through the veins of the dead city to find the beating heart trapped in the museum. As I moved back toward the ventilation grate, the radio in my pocket, which I thought I had turned off, crackled. Just static. But inside the static, buried deep in the white noise, was a pattern. Asterisk click. Click click. Click. Asterisk. And then, a voice, crystal clear, as if standing right next to me. "Watchtower 1, we see you." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was synthesized. A perfect amalgamation of 1,000 human voices stitched together. "Welcome to the game," it said. Then silence. The silence that followed the synthesized voice was heavier than the concrete slab above my head. It wasn't the empty silence of the dead zone, the kind that signifies the absence of life. This was a pregnant, watchful silence. A silence that breathed. "Welcome to the game." The words rattled around the inside of my skull, bouncing off the walls of my paranoia. Watchtower 1. That was my call sign from the first week, back when the grid was still flickering. Back when there were actually people to talk to on the other end of the line. I hadn't spoken those words aloud in 3 months. That meant this intelligence, this harvester, or whatever controlled it, had been listening. Archiving. Learning. It wasn't just a machine, it was a predator that studied its prey's history before going in for the kill. I didn't reply. To speak now would be to validate it, to accept the invitation. I turned the radio dial all the way down until the volume clicked off, though I knew it was a futile gesture. If it could transmit on a dead channel, it could likely track the passive signal of the receiver itself. I considered smashing the device, leaving the fragments in the dust, but the survivalist in me revolted. Information was life. Even if the radio was a leash, it was also my only set of ears. I pulled the battery pack instead, sliding the heavy lithium brick into a separate pouch lined with Lee mesh. A remnant from a scavenged X-ray text kit. If they were tracking the power signature, that might ghost me for a few hours. I looked back through the crack in the garage door one last time. The harvester was still there, a monolith of alien geometry etched against the bruised purple sky. Its violet searchlight continued to stroke the face of the museum like a lover's hand, tender and possessive. It wasn't attacking. It was waiting. It was the warden, and I was about to break into the prison. I retreated into the shadows, moving with the agonizing slowness of a creature that knows it is being hunted from above. I reached the ventilation grate I had crawled out of hours ago. It felt like a lifetime. The air wafting up from the depths was cool and smelled of wet rust and old decay, the perfume of the underworld. I slid the grate back into place behind me, the scrape of metal on concrete sounding like a gunshot in the quiet garage. I froze, waiting for the ceiling to be torn away by a mechanical claw, but nothing happened. The game, it seemed, had rules. And rule number 1 was that I had to make the first move. Descending the ladder back into the subway tunnels felt like sinking into the ocean. The pressure grew with every rung. I switched my flashlight to the red filter. White light was a luxury I could no longer afford. It carried too far, reflected too brightly. The red light turned the tunnel into a developed photograph, a world of high-contrast crimson and black. It hid the true color of the mold growing on the walls, for which I was grateful. In the red light, the slime looked like oil. In white light, I knew it looked too much like organic matter. I reached the platform of the station I had claimed as a temporary base. My footsteps on the tile were muffled by the thick layers of dust and grime, a carpet woven by time and neglect. I checked my compass. The needle jittered, magnetic interference from the surface, probably the harvester's jamming field, but it settled roughly north. I needed to go back 2 stations, deeper into the commercial district's substructure, to find the spur line. The walk was an exercise in sensory deprivation. My world was limited to the 3-meter cone of red light ahead of me. Beyond that, the tunnel was a throat waiting to swallow. I kept my rifle shouldered, safety off, finger resting on the trigger guard. Every shadow that stretched across the tracks looked like a glitch. Every dripping pipe sounded like a footstep. I focused on my breathing, the rhythmic hiss-click of the respirator valve. It was a metronome keeping the panic at bay. I passed the first station, a hollowed-out shell called Civic Center. The platform was littered with the baggage of the fleeing masses, suitcases burst open, rotting clothes scattered like confetti. Strollers overturned. It was a graveyard of intentions. I stepped carefully over a pile of sleeping bags that had fused together with damp and rot. I didn't look too closely at the shapes inside them. In the dead zone, you learned quickly that curiosity didn't kill the cat, it broke the survivor's mind. Reaching the access point for the spur line took an hour of careful navigation. The map I had memorized, a crumpled maintenance schematic I'd found in a janitor's closet weeks ago, indicated a service door hidden behind a false wall. In the maintenance alcove of the Union Square station. I found the alcove. The false wall had partially collapsed, revealing the rusted steel door behind it. It was marked with a faded yellow sign, Danger, High Voltage/Flood Risk. I holstered the rifle and gripped the wheel of the door. It was cold, the metal biting through my gloves. I braced my boots against the wall and heaved. Nothing. Decades of oxidation had welded it shut. I took a breath, holding it to steady my core, and pulled again, putting my back into it. A groan of protesting metal echoed down the tunnel, a sound so loud I flinched. The wheel turned a quarter rotation. Then another. With a shriek of tearing rust, the door popped open, swinging inward into darkness. The smell hit me instantly, penetrating even the charcoal filters of my mask. It was a chemical tang, sharp and acidic, mixed with the heavy, sweet scent of stagnant water. I shone the red light into the void. Steps led down. And at the bottom of the steps, the black water waited. This was the spur line. It sat lower than the main tracks, dipping beneath the water table. The pumps had failed 20 years ago. Now, it was a subterranean river of sludge. I checked the seals on my suit. The Mark IV environmental suit was designed for biohazards, not deep-sea diving, but it was watertight as long as I didn't tear it. I ran my hands over the duct tape I had used to reinforce the joints at the knees and elbows. It held. I tightened the straps on my rucksack, moving the heavier gear higher up to keep my center of gravity manageable. Into the veins, I whispered to myself. I descended the stairs. The water met me at the ankles first. It was freezing, a cold that seeped through the rubber boots instantly. It felt thick, oily. As I walked deeper, the water rose, calves, knees, thighs. By the time I reached the track bed, the water was at my waist. Moving through it was a nightmare. The sludge provided resistance against every motion, turning a simple walk into a slow-motion trudge. The bottom was uneven, littered with unseen debris. My foot caught on something, a submerged railroad tie, a piece of machinery, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before I dipped my rifle into the muck. I held the weapon high, stock pressed against my shoulder, aiming blindly into the dark tunnel ahead. The acoustic dynamics changed here. The water absorbed sound, deadening the echoes, making the tunnel feel incredibly small and intimate. The only sound was the sloshing of liquid around my waist and the thumping of my heart. I checked the map in my head. The spur line ran straight for 400 meters, then curved sharp left under the park, terminating in a logistics basement beneath the museum. 400 meters. In these conditions, that was an eternity. I had gone perhaps 100 meters when the water level began to rise. The tunnel floor was sloping downward. The sludge crept up my chest. I could feel the pressure of it against the suit, compressing the fabric against my skin. The cold was numbing my extremities. I had to keep moving. To stop was to freeze. Something brushed against my leg. I froze. The motion wasn't the swirl of my own wake. It was distinct. Solid. I swept the red light down into the black water. Nothing but the opaque, oily surface. Just debris, I told myself. Asterisk, just a floating piece of trash. Asterisk. I took another step. Asterisk, bump. Asterisk. Again. Against my left thigh. Harder this time. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I wasn't alone in the water. I spun in a slow circle, the water dragging at me, scanning the surface. Ripples moved outward from a point near the tunnel wall. Something was moving under the surface. Most glitches were humanoid, shambling, broken things that mimicked the people they used to be. But the dead zone twisted biology. I had heard rumors of things that lived in the flooded sub-basements. Eels that had grown to the size of pythons, feeding on the chemical runoff. Rats that had adapted to hold their breath. I unslung the rifle, knowing it was risky to fire in such a confined space. The ricochet could kill me, or the noise could bring the roof down. Instead, I drew the combat knife strapped to my chest rig. The blade was 12 inches of matte black steel. It felt pitifully small against the unknown. I waited. The ripples settled. The silence returned. Come on, I breathed. Nothing. I forced myself to turn back to the path. I couldn't fight a ghost. I had to keep moving. I took a step, then another, my muscles tense, waiting for the bite. But it didn't come. Whatever was in the water with me was curious, or perhaps full. Or maybe it was just hurting me. The water was at my armpits now. I had to crab walk, keeping my head and the pack high. The ceiling of the tunnel was getting lower, or the floor was dropping deeper. The clearance above the water was less than 2 feet. I was trapped in a horizontal crevice of air between the sludge and the concrete. Then, the worst happened. The tunnel ceiling dipped. A structural collapse ahead had brought a slab of concrete down, creating a choke point. There was a gap. I could see the darkness continuing on the other side, but the clearance was mere inches. I couldn't walk under it. I would have to submerge. I stared at the obstacle. To go under meant fully submerging my head, my mask, my filters. The filters were water-resistant, but not waterproof. If the sludge saturated the charcoal, I would suffocate. If the seal on the mask failed, the toxic water would fill my lungs. I looked back. The way I came was a black throat. The way forward was a tomb. Welcome to the game, the voice had said. This was the first level boss. I reached up and tightened the straps of my mask until the rubber dug painfully into my skin. I checked the seal around my neck. I unclipped the radio pouch and held it high in one hand, gripping the knife in the other. I would have to drag myself along the bottom, eyes closed, holding my breath, praying the seal held. I took 3 hyperventilating breaths to oxygenate my blood. 1, 2, 3. I dropped beneath the surface. The silence was absolute. The cold was a physical blow, a hammer smashing into every inch of my body. The sludge was thick, viscous like gelatin. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, trusting the mask to protect them, but I could feel the weight of the liquid pressing against the lenses. I reached out with my free hand, feeling for the bottom. It was slick, coated in a layer of slime that felt like rotted flesh. I dug my fingers into the muck and pulled. My tank-like movements were sluggish. I pulled again, my knuckles scraping against rough concrete. I felt the overhead slab brush against my back, a rough, jagged ceiling pinning me down. Panic flared, primitive, reptilian brain panic. Asterisk trapped. Buried. Drowning. Asterisk I fought the urge to thrash. Thrashing burned oxygen. Thrashing tore suits. I dragged myself forward. 1 meter. 2 meters. My lungs began to burn. The carbon dioxide buildup was a hot coal in my chest. Asterisk just a little further. Asterisk. My hand struck something vertical. Rebar. A tangle of it blocking the path. No. I groped frantically. I was stuck under the slab, underwater, with seconds of air left. Think. The knife. I slashed at the obstruction, metal clinking dully underwater. It was wire mesh, not thick rebar. Debris fencing. I sawed at it, the motion desperate. The wire snagged my sleeve. I ripped my arm back, tearing the outer layer of the suit, but the inner seal held. I slashed again, putting all my fear into the blade. The mesh gave way. I pushed through the hole, the jagged wires scraping the sides of my suit. My lungs were screaming now, spasms rocking my diaphragm. I needed air now. I kicked off the bottom, propelling myself upward. My head broke the surface. I gasped, the intake valve of the mask shuddering violently as it sucked in air. I choked, coughed, and gasped again. The air was foul, but it was air. I wiped the sludge from my faceplate. It smeared, leaving an oily film, but I could see. I was on the other side. The ceiling was higher here. The water was shallowing. I scrambled up a slope of debris, my legs shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline dump and the cold. I dragged myself out of the black liquid and onto a concrete ledge. I lay there for a long time, just breathing, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the sludge running off my suit. I checked the mask. The filters were damp but functioning. The suit had abrasions, but no breaches. I had survived the swim. I stood up, my legs heavy as lead. I shone the red light around. I was in a sub-basement. The architecture had changed. The tunnel walls were gone, replaced by brick arches and heavy stone foundations. This was old construction. The original foundations of the city, upon which the museum was built. I found the service ladder I was looking for. It led up to a hatch labeled Museum Freight Elevator Maintenance. I climbed, the rusted rungs groaning under my weight. At the top I listened. Silence. I pushed the hatch. It was unlocked. I emerged into a room filled with hydraulic machinery, the guts of the freight elevator system. It was dry here. Dusty. I was inside. I moved to the door of the machinery room and cracked it open. A long corridor stretched out, lined with storage crates. But as I stepped out, the floor beneath me trembled. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. It was the harvester. It was right above me, patrolling the perimeter of the building. The vibration was so strong it rattled my teeth. It was a constant reminder of the scale of the enemy. I checked my rifle. Dry. I racked the charging handle, seating around. I began to sweep the basement, looking for the stairs up to the main level, or better yet, the source of the survivors' signal. The North Bridge message implied they were on the upper levels, but if they were smart, they would have retreated down here to avoid the violet gaze of the machine. I turned a corner and stopped dead. In the center of the hallway, sitting on a wooden crate, was a radio. It was an old transistor model, pristine, looking completely out of place amidst the dust and cobwebs. It was on. The static hiss was low, rhythmic. I approached it slowly, rifle raised. It felt like a trap. It was a trap. But I had to know. I reached out and touched the volume dial. The static cut out instantly. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the speaker crackled. "Checkpoint reached," the synthesized voice said. It sounded amused. "You are surprisingly resilient, Watchtower 1. Most don't make it past the swim." I stared at the radio. The voice wasn't broadcasting from the outside. It was coming from inside the building. "Where are they?" I rasped, my voice sounding wrecked through the modulator of my mask. "Where are the survivors?" "Survivors?" The voice mimicked, the tone shifting, warping into a digitized laugh. "Oh, you misunderstand the nature of this exhibition. There are no survivors here, Watchtower. Only players." A loud clank echoed from the far end of the corridor. Metal on metal. Then the sound of heavy, wet footsteps. Not the rhythmic stomp of the machine outside. These were the shuffling, dragging steps of things that had once been human, but were now something else entirely. "Round 2 begins now," the voice whispered. "Try not to make a mess of the artifacts." I spun around, aiming down the corridor. Out of the shadows, shapes began to emerge. They wore the tattered remains of museum security uniforms. Their skin was pale, translucent, glowing faintly with the same violet hue as the harvester's eye. Glitches. But these were different. They didn't shamble aimlessly. They moved in formation. They were armed. I flicked the safety off. The game was rigged. But I wasn't planning on playing by the rules anymore. The corridor erupted into a strobe light nightmare. I didn't wait for them to raise their weapons. Survival in the dead zone isn't about hesitation. It is about acting on the half-second instinct that screams before your brain can process the threat. I dropped to one knee, the concrete biting into my joint through the suit, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, the stock digging into the bruise that had been forming there for 3 months. The sound was deafening in the confined hallway. In the open wasteland, a gunshot is a crack that gets swallowed by the wind. Here, amidst the concrete and steel, it was a physical blow to the eardrums. The first round caught the lead figure in the center of mass. There was no spray of red mist. Instead, a burst of violet vapor vented from the wound, hissing like a punctured steam pipe. The figure stumbled back, the impact kinetic and heavy, but it didn't fall. It didn't scream. It simply corrected its balance with a mechanical fluidity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They raised their weapons. They were holding rusted submachine guns, archaic MP5s that looked like they had been dug out of a bog, but the way they held them was perfect. Elbows tucked, stocks welded to cheeks. I rolled to the right, crashing behind a stack of heavy wooden crates stamped with the museum's logistics logo just as the air where my head had been filled with lead. Bullets chewed into the concrete floor, sending sharp fragments of stone pinging against my visor. The sound of their fire was different, dull, wet thuds, as if the powder in their cartridges was damp, yet the velocity was lethal. Suppressive fire, I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the bottom of my mask. They know tactics. This wasn't a zombie horde. This was a squad. I pressed my back against the rough wood of the crate, checking the magazine. 28 rounds left. No backup. No extraction. Just a voice in a box telling me I was a player in a game I never signed up for. The harvester outside took another step. Asterisk thump. Asterisk the dust fell from the ceiling, coating my visor in a fine gray powder. The vibration shook the crate against my spine, a massive, rhythmic reminder that I was trapped between a hammer and an anvil. I needed to move. Staying static was a death sentence. I pulled a flash bang from my webbing. It was old, the pin rusted, a relic I'd scavenged from a dead patrolman on day 42. I didn't know if the fuse was reliable. I didn't know if these things, these glitches, even relied on sight. But I had to try. I yanked the pin. It offered gritty resistance before popping free. I counted to 2, listening to the shuffling boots on the concrete. They were advancing. Controlled. Methodical. I tossed the canister over the crate and scrambled backward on my hands and heels, keeping my head low. The explosion was a dull crump followed by a high-pitched whine that cut through my noise-canceling headset. A brilliant white light washed out the shadows of the corridor. I surged forward, rising to a crouch, rifle up. The formation was broken. 2 of the figures were staggering, clutching their faces. The third, the one I'd shot, was kneeling, its weapon traversing blindly. The violet light leaking from its chest wound pulsed in time with the harvester's footsteps outside. I didn't spray and pray. I didn't have the ammo for it. I double-tapped the kneeling one. 2 rounds to the head. The helmet shattered, revealing not bone and brain, but a lattice of crystalline growth glowing with that sickening purple hue. The light inside it flickered and died. The body slumped. 1 down. The other 2 were recovering fast. Too fast. I turned and sprinted. I abandoned the stealth approach. I ran hard, my boots slamming against the floor, the heavy maintenance bag bouncing against my lower back. I heard the snap hiss of bullets passing my ear, burying themselves in the drywall ahead of me. I took a sharp left into a maintenance bay, slamming the heavy steel door behind me and spinning the locking wheel. It shrieked in protest, rust grinding on rust, but the bolts slid home just as a heavy weight slammed into the metal from the other side. I backed away, chest heaving, rifle leveled at the door. Asterisk bang. 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 Asterisk. They were beating on it with their rifle butts, or perhaps their fists. But the door held. It was reinforced blast-grade steel, designed to protect the exhibits from boiler explosions. I lowered the weapon, my arms trembling. The adrenaline dump was hitting me now, that sickening wash of weakness that follows a life-or-death spike. I leaned against a cold pipe, sliding down until I hit the floor. Check your seal, I muttered, the mantra of the wasteland. I ran my gloved hands over my suit. No tears. No leaks. The Geiger counter on my wrist was clicking steadily, a slow, rhythmic tick-tick-tick that indicated background radiation was high but not immediately fatal. The air in here was stale, tasting of copper and dead electricity. I took a moment to assess the room. It was a boiler room, dominated by 3 massive furnaces that had been cold for decades. Pipes ran along the ceiling like the arteries of a dead giant. In the corner, a service ladder led upward to a grate. Up. I had to go up. But first, I needed to understand. Players, the voice had said. I pulled my water flask from my belt, unsealed the drinking port on my mask, and took a long, tepid pull. The water tasted of iodine and plastic, but it was the best thing I'd ever experienced. I let it wash away the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds. Just 3. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw the days stretching back. The 100 days in the dead zone. The isolation. The eating of rats and lichen. The slow degradation of my mind. I had kept going because of the signal. Because of the voice I had heard on the loop, a human voice, crying for help. Was that a lie too? Was the signal just a lure to bring fresh meat into this arena? I opened my eyes. Anger was better than fear. Anger was a fuel source. I stood up, my joints popping. I checked the rifle again. 24 rounds. I had a sidearm with 2 spare mags and a combat knife that had seen more use opening cans than cutting throats. It wasn't enough to fight a war, but it was enough to cause a problem. I climbed the ladder. The rungs were slick with condensation. At the top, I pushed against the grate. It moved easily. I emerged into a totally different world. The basement had been industrial, grimy, the intestines of the building. This was the ribcage. I was in the grand hall of the museum. Even in the dim light filtering through the boarded-up skylights, it was breathtaking. And terrifying. The ceiling soared 50 feet above me, supported by marble columns that were surprisingly intact. But the space was dominated by the exhibits. Giant skeletons of whales and dinosaurs hung suspended from the ceiling wires, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. But something was wrong with them. I moved closer to a triceratops skeleton, my boots making no sound on the plush, dust-covered carpet. The bones were wrapped in wire. Copper wire, fiber optics, thick black cables. They wove through the ribs and the eye sockets, pulsing with a faint, dormant energy. In the center of the ribcage, where the heart would be, sat a metal box with a glowing violet diode. They had weaponized the exhibits. Or animated them. "Welcome to the gallery," the voice boomed. I dropped to a crouch behind a display case filled with ancient pottery, scanning the balconies above. The voice wasn't coming from a radio this time. It was coming from the museum's public address system. It echoed, bouncing off the marble, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. "You are currently in the Natural History Wing," the voice continued, smooth, synthesized, and utterly lacking in empathy. "Please observe the modifications. We found the original designs, lacking in lethality." I stayed low, moving between the display cases. I needed cover. The open floor was a kill zone. "Who are you?" I shouted. I knew revealing my position was dangerous, but I needed him to keep talking. As long as he was gloating, he might not be shooting. "I am the curator," the voice replied. "And you are the new exhibition. Watchtower 1. A fascinating specimen. High endurance. Low social drive. Incredible pain threshold. We have been watching your biometrics since you crossed the perimeter wall." My blood ran cold. My suit. The suit I had found in the supply bunker on day 1. It wasn't just protective gear. It was a tracker. A telemetry unit. I looked down at the control panel on my left forearm. The bio readout, the radiation levels, the oxygen mix, it was all being fed to him. He knew my heart rate. He knew how terrified I was. I fought the urge to rip the suit off. Without it, the radiation in the dead zone would liquefy my organs in an hour. I was trapped in the very thing keeping me alive. "You lured me here," I said, moving toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall. "The distress signal. The survivors." "A narrative necessity," the curator said. "Motivation is key to performance. Without a goal, the rat does not run the maze. It simply sits and starves. And we couldn't have that. The audience gets bored." "Audience?" I reached the base of the stairs. They were wide, marble steps leading up to a mezzanine level. The north bridge the signal had mentioned. If there was a control room, it would be up there. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. The building shook again. The harvester. It was close. The dust on the railing danced. "But let us raise the stakes," the curator said, his voice dropping an octave. "The scavenger phase is over. The hunter phase begins." A spotlight clicked on. It originated from the ceiling, a harsh, theater-style beam that hit the center of the room. It illuminated the massive skeletal reconstruction of a Tyrannosaurus rex. Like the Triceratops, it was laced with cables and hydraulics. Its skull was encased in a transparent polymer helmet. Its jaws were reinforced with serrated steel. And then the eyes glowed. Violet. The hum of machinery started low and built to a whine. The cables tensed. The skeleton shifted, dust cascading off its vertebrae. It took a step. The sound of bone and steel hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. "Run," the curator whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind me, the T-Rex roared, a synthesized, distorted screech of grinding metal and digital fury that vibrated in my chest cavity. I heard the crash of glass as it smashed through a display case, pursuing me. It was slow, heavy, but its stride was massive. I reached the mezzanine and vaulted over the railing, landing on a checkered tile floor. I scrambled up and looked for a door, a hallway, anything smaller than a dinosaur. To my left, a set of double doors labeled administration. I ran for them. Below, the T-Rex slammed into the base of the staircase. The marble cracked. The beast threw its head back and snapped its jaws at the balcony, missing my boots by feet. The wind of its bite knocked me off balance, but I recovered. I hit the doors with my shoulder. Locked. I stepped back, raised the rifle, and blew the lock out. I kicked the door open and dove inside, spinning around to jam a heavy filing cabinet in front of it. From the other side, I heard the beast roar again, followed by the heavy thud of its body ramming the wall below the balcony. It couldn't get up here. The stairs wouldn't hold it. I was safe. For now. I stood in the center of the administration office, panting, sweat stinging my eyes. The room was dark, illuminated only by the flashing red light of a silent alarm system. Desks were overturned. Papers were scattered everywhere, old memos, rotas, security logs. I moved to the nearest desk, sweeping the papers aside. I needed intel. I needed to know the layout. My flashlight beam cut across a wall map. Museum schematics. I traced the lines with a shaking finger. I was on level 2. The administration wing. Above me, level 3, the planetarium and the radio tower access. Radio tower. If the signal was a lure, the transmission source still had to exist. If I could get to the tower, maybe I could broadcast something else. A warning. Or maybe I could find where this curator was hiding. But as I looked at the map, something else caught my eye. Marked in red ink on the schematic, circled multiple times, was a room on this floor. Room 204. Next to it, scrawled in handwriting that looked frantic and jagged, were the words, *, they are watching. Cut the feed. *. I looked at the door numbers. I was in 201. Room 204 was down the hall. I checked the corridor. Empty. Silence had returned, heavy and oppressive, save for the distant, rhythmic thumping of the harvester outside and the faint mechanical whirring of the dinosaur downstairs. I crept down the hallway, counting the doors. 202, 203. 204 was slightly ajar. A blue light flickered from inside. I pushed the door open with the barrel of my rifle. The room was filled with monitors. Banks of them. Old CRT screens stacked floor to ceiling. I stepped inside, mesmerizing horror washing over me. The screens were active. On one, I saw the basement corridor I had just left, the bodies of the glitches being dragged away by other, darker shapes. On another, the grand hall, where the T-Rex was now standing dormant, entering a standby mode. But the center screens. The center screens showed the wasteland. There were dozens of feeds. Different angles. Different locations in the dead zone. And in each one, there was a person. A woman in a hazmat suit fighting off a pack of wild dogs in a subway tunnel. A man bandaging a leg wound in the ruins of a library. A group of 3 trying to hotwire a rusted APC. Watchtower 239, I whispered. We weren't just survivors. We were contestants. I stepped closer to the console. The desk was littered with empty coffee cups that had developed their own ecosystems of mold, and betting slips. Paper slips with names, odds, and payouts. * Watchtower 1. Odds of reaching the museum 50:1. *. Watchtower 1. Time of death day 98. *. I had beaten the odds. I was an anomaly. You found the control room. The curator's voice came from the console speakers now. It was softer, intimate. Impressive. Most players focus on escape. You focus on understanding. That is why you are my favorite. Where are you? I snarled at the screen. Closer than you think. But looking at the screens won't save you. You need to look at the logs. I looked down at the keyboard. A logbook lay open. I flipped the pages. It wasn't just betting. It was experimentation notes. Asterisk subject 104, neural degradation accelerated by localized infrasound. Asterisk. Asterisk subject 108, mutagenic compound introduced to water supply. Results, violet luminescence in blood plasma within 4 hours. Asterisk. My hand went to my throat. The water. The water I had been drinking for the last 100 days. The water I had just drunk from my flask. I looked at my hand. Under the grime and the glove, was the skin faintly translucent? Was there a subtle, violet hum under my veins? The dead zone changes you, the curator purred. But we help it along. We are looking for the perfect synthesis of man and machine. The glitches downstairs? Failed prototypes. Too mindless. But you have retained your tactical cognition. You are integrating the isotope beautifully. I retched. I fell to my knees, dry heaving. The realization was a physical punch to the gut. I wasn't just fighting monsters. I was becoming one. Why? I gasped. Because the world outside is dead, Watchtower. Humanity is extinct. We are the archive. We are preserving the genetic potential of the species by forcing it to evolve. You aren't a survivor. You are a product. I stared at the floor. The tile pattern blurred. No. I wouldn't accept it. If I was a monster, then I would be a monster that destroyed its creator. I stood up. The nausea passed, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The violet tint in my vision didn't scare me anymore. It made everything sharper. I could see the heat signature of the wires behind the wall. I could hear the hum of the electricity in the devastatingly high frequencies. I looked at the bank of monitors. You're watching, I said. Good. I raised my rifle and smashed the butt into the center screen. Glass exploded. Sparks showered the room. I moved down the line, smashing every monitor, every camera, every glowing eye of the curator. Temper, the curator laughed, but there was a flicker of annoyance in the synthesis. You are only blinding yourself. I don't need to see you, I said, seating a fresh magazine. I just need to find the top of the tower. I grabbed the master keycard lying on the console. It was labeled Director. I turned to leave, but stopped at the door. On the wall, there was a mirror. I looked at my reflection. The mask covered my face, but through the visor, my eyes. My eyes were glowing. A faint, burning violet. I didn't look away. I stared into the abyss of my own reflection, and the abyss stared back, armed and dangerous. Round 3, I whispered. I kicked the door open and headed for the stairwell that led to the roof. The harvester outside screamed, a sound of tearing metal that signaled it had found a breach. It was coming in. Good. Let them all come. I began to climb. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of oppressive concrete, smelling of ancient dust and the metallic tang of dried blood. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. I counted them, not to keep track of distance, but to anchor a mind that was rapidly trying to unravel. Every footfall of my tactical boots sent a dull vibration up my shin, registering with a terrifying new clarity. The violet luminescence in my vision wasn't just a tint, it was an overlay. I could see the stress fractures in the rebar beneath the cement. I could see the intricate web of airflow moving down the spiral shaft, carrying thermal pockets of stale heat. My body felt heavy, yet paradoxically weightless. The mutagenic water I'd consumed for 3 months had done more than poison me, it had optimized me. My heart rate was a steady 40 beats per minute despite the exertion of the climb. I could feel the individual fibers of my muscles contracting and releasing with the precision of hydraulic pistons. The curator called it evolution. I called it a violation. But as I checked the chamber of my rifle, a press check I had performed 10,000 times in the dead zone, I realized that for the next hour, I needed to be exactly what they wanted me to be. A weapon. Floor 82. The door to the landing was welded shut, but through the reinforced steel, I heard them skittering. Wet, slapping sounds against the linoleum of the hallway beyond. The curator wasn't sending the mindless glitches anymore. Those were for the early days, for the calibration phase. Now, as I neared the summit of the tower, the containment protocols were escalating. I paused on the landing, my back pressed against the cold cinder block. I closed my eyes, letting the visual input fade, and focused on the auditory. The violet hum shifted from my eyes to my ears. I could hear the mechanics of the door lock. I could hear the breathing on the other side. Not the ragged, gasping breath of the infected, but the rhythmic, regulated respiration of things that had been designed. 3 targets. Heavy mass. Bipedal, but hunched. You are struggling against the inevitable, the curator's voice echoed. It didn't come from a speaker this time. It seemed to resonate from the walls themselves, vibrating through the building's structural integrity. The harvester is already on the roof. It is preparing the transmission. Once the signal goes out, the localized dampening field drops. The dead zone expands. You are trying to stop a tidal wave with a teacup. I don't need to stop the wave, I whispered, the words rasping against a throat that felt lined with sandpaper. I just need to break the machine making the waves. I didn't try the door. I knew it was a kill zone. Instead, I looked up. The stairwell wound upward around a central gap, a straight drop to the basement far below. Above me, on the underside of the next flight of stairs, I saw the heat signature of a structural weakness, a patch of concrete eroded by decades of leaking water pipes. I swung the rifle and pulled the tactical tomahawk from my belt. The grip felt molded to my hand. I leaped. It wasn't a human jump. It was an explosion of kinetic energy. I caught the railing of the floor above, my fingers digging into the metal with enough force to dent it. I swung my legs up, silently vaulting over the banister, bypassing the ambush on floor 82 entirely. As I landed on the concrete of floor 83, the door below burst open. The creatures surged into the stairwell, realized their target wasn't there, and shrieked. It was a sound like tearing metal. I looked down through the gap. They were pale, elongated things, their limbs reinforced with exoskeletal bracing that shimmered in the gloom. They looked like me. Or what I was becoming. I didn't shoot. Gunfire in a stairwell is a dinner bell. I kept moving. Floor 90. Floor 95. The air was getting thinner, colder. The atmospheric pressure change usually made my ears pop, but now, my physiology adjusted instantly, equalizing the pressure without a thought. At floor 99, the door to the roof access stood before me. It wasn't a standard fire door. It was a bulkhead, a massive slab of blast-proof iron secured with a magnetic locking mechanism. The keypad on the wall was dead, smashed by someone, or something, long ago. I approached the door. I could feel the energy humming behind it. The roof wasn't just an exit, it was the broadcast center. I placed my hand on the cold iron. The violet light in my veins pulsed, syncing with the electromagnetic field of the lock. I wasn't hacking it with a computer, I was interfacing with it through touch. The static shock that should have stopped my heart instead fed me. With a heavy, mechanical clunk, the maglocks disengaged. I took a breath. The last breath of stale air. Beyond this door was the sky. The truth. I kicked the bar. The door swung outward, caught by a howling wind that instantly whipped into the stairwell. I stepped out onto the roof. The world I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The curator had said humanity was extinct. I expected a scorched earth, a nuclear wasteland, or a silent, overgrown planet. Instead, I saw nothing. The tower stood in the center of a swirling, opaque vortex of gray fog. It was a wall of clouds, stretching from the ground to the heavens, circling the building like the eye of a hurricane. The dead zone wasn't just a quarantine area, it was a localized dimension, a bubble of reality severed from the rest of the world. And in the center of the roof, amidst a tangle of satellite dishes and thick black cables, sat the harvester. Up close, it was hideous in its majesty. It was the size of a tank, a suspended torso of biomechanical flesh hanging from a rig of steel pylons. It had no legs, only thick, bundled cables that plunged into the roof like roots, feeding off the building's power grid. Its head was a cluster of sensor optics and human skulls fused together in a resinous helmet. It turned toward me. The sound of its movement was the groan of stressed hydraulics. Subject 119, the curator's voice boomed from the harvester itself. The creature's mouth, a speaker grill sutured into the flesh, didn't move. You have reached the apex. This is where the data is harvested. This is where the cycle ends. I raised my rifle. The wind tore at my tactical vest, flapping the loose straps against my armor. Where is the rest of the world? I shouted over the gale. What is beyond the fog? Chaos, the curator replied. Entropy. The outside world is a chaotic variable we cannot control. Here, in the zone, we create order. We forge the future one prototype at a time. You are the pinnacle, watchtower. Look at yourself. You are breathing air that is toxic to a baseline human. You are standing in radiation that would liquefy your organs. And yet you are stronger than you have ever been. Why would you want to leave? Because I'm not a machine. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, the recoil dampened by my enhanced musculature. The rounds were armor-piercing incendiaries. They struck the harvester's central chassis, sparking wildly against the plating. The creature roared, a digital, glitching scream, and one of its manipulator arms, a massive claw on a telescoping boom, swung at me. I didn't dodge, I calculated. The violet overlay showed me the arc of the swing before it completed. I slid underneath the blow, the wind of its passage rustling my hair. I came up in a crouch, combat knife in my left hand, rifle in my right. I sprinted toward the main pylon. The harvester was stationary, anchored to the roof, but its reach was incredible. Another arm, this one tipped with a rotary saw, slashed down. I rolled, feeling the concrete shatter inches from my spine. Debris peppered my suit. I was inside its guard. I jammed the barrel of my rifle into the bundle of cables that served as the harvester's root system. I dumped the magazine. 30 rounds of high-velocity lead shredded the power conduits. Blue arcs of electricity exploded outward, throwing me back. I hit a ventilation unit hard, the metal crumpling under my impact. Pain flared, real, sharp pain, but it faded instantly, metabolized by the mutagen. The harvester shrieked, its movements becoming erratic, jerky. The lights on its sensor cluster strobed red. Critical failure, the curator's voice wavered, losing its smooth, synthesized composure. Subject is hostile. Initiating purge protocol. The roof vents hissed. Green gas, the neurotoxin from the lower levels, began to flood the open space, swirling with the wind. I stood up. My mask was cracked. I ripped it off. The gas hit my face. It tasted like copper and ozone. It burned my lungs, but I didn't choke. My body accepted it, processed it, integrated it. I inhaled deeply, my eyes burning with that intense violet flame. Your poison doesn't work anymore, I growled. I looked at the harvester. It was bleeding, black oil and red blood mixing on the roof tiles. But it was still active. The central core, a glowing cylinder in its chest, was pulsing. The transmitter. I had one grenade left. A thermite charge I had scavenged from the armory on day 40. I pulled the pin. Wait! The voice didn't come from the harvester. It came from the small, smashed radio clipped to my belt. The radio that had been silent for 100 days. It was the human voice. Don't destroy the transmitter. The voice crackled, desperate, undeniably human. A woman's voice. Please! It's not just a transmitter. It's a lock. I froze, the spoon of the grenade held tight in my hand. Who is this? I yelled at the radio. My name is Ilara, the voice cried. I'm outside. Beyond the fog. Listen to me. The curator is lying about the extinction, but he's telling the truth about the danger. The dead zone isn't keeping you in. It's keeping them out. I looked at the swirling wall of gray clouds. Shapes were moving in the fog. Massive, serpentine shadows that dwarfed the tower. Things that defied physics. The barrier is failing, Ilara said. The curator went rogue, tried to weaponize the humans inside to fight the things outside. But if you destroy the harvester, the dampening field collapses completely. The fog lifts. And everything out here comes in there. I looked at the harvester. The curator was silent now, watching me. A choice, the curator whispered, its voice sounding small, almost tired. Be the monster that saves the cage, or the human that opens the door to hell. My hand trembled. The thermite burned hot against my palm, figurative fire waiting to be unleashed. If I destroyed it, I was free. But I would unleash the unknown horrors of the outside upon whatever remained of this facility. If I spared it, the experiment continued. I remained a prisoner. A lab rat. But I looked at my hands. The violet veins. The translucent skin. I wasn't a human anymore. I wasn't a survivor. Ilara, I said into the radio. Are there people out there? Survivors? Yes, she wept. We are hiding. We are barely holding on. If the barrier falls. I looked at the harvester. I looked at the dark sky above the fog. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to destroy the machine. And I wasn't going to serve it. I ran toward the harvester, leaping over the thrashing cables. I didn't throw the grenade at the core. I threw it at the interface console, the control mechanism that allowed the curator to drive the beast. Thermite bloomed. White-hot heat melted steel and bone instantly. The curator's voice dissolved into a digital scream of agony before cutting out completely. The harvester went limp, its systems crashing, reverting to a dormant state. The hum of the barrier remained. The fog wall held steady. The curator was gone. The jailer was dead. But the jail remained. I stood alone on the roof, the wind howling around me. The harvester was now just a pile of meat and metal, humming with a low, autonomous power. I picked up the radio. Ilara? I'm here, she whispered. What did you do? I bought us time, I said. I walked to the edge of the roof and looked down into the abyss of the dead zone. The city below was silent. The glitches, the beasts, the horrors, they were all still down there. And now, I was the only thing at the top of the tower. I sat down on the edge, my legs dangling over a 100-story drop. I took a sip from my flask. The mutagenic water tasted sweet. I'm not coming out, Ilara, I said, watching the violet glow of my own reflection in the darkened glass of a solar panel. I belong in the dead zone now. Someone has to keep the wall up. Someone has to make sure nothing from inside gets out, and nothing from outside gets in. There was a long silence on the radio. You're the new curator, she said softly. I looked at the dormant harvester. I could feel its systems calling to me, recognizing my biology as compatible. I could interface with it. I could control the zone. Not as a cruel experimenter, but as a warden. No, I said, closing my eyes and listening to the hum of the city below, my city. I'm just the watchtower. I clicked the radio off. I sat there for a long time, watching the gray fog swirl, a lone gargoyle perched on the edge of the world, glowing violet in the dark. The experiment was over. The reign of the watchtower had begun.